I miss? The pandemic. It was brilliant, wasn't it? The $5 trillion wealth transfer. Can't remember which direction it went. The depression, the closure of small businesses. Wouldn't it be mad if we found out that the very people that were recommending the measures and medicines for that pandemic were the people that benefited? That would actually make me quite angry. Hey! Hello there, you 6 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage towards truth and freedom. Thanks for staying steady and not for going, oh, the pandemic, that was ages ago. Well, now guess what we can tell you? Some of the people that were most front and center, visible, lionized, celebrated and hero worshipped throughout that pandemic, guess what? Guess what? They profited from it. They made new money that they would not otherwise have made had it not been for that pandemic. And for me, that means they profited from the pandemic. Let's get into this story. Hold on to your hats and keep your body hole tightly shut. Okay, for a start, do you remember when Bill Gates said this?
This is a great vaccine. It looks like almost all the vaccines are going to succeed. It is great science, great industrial manufacturing.
There's the old media nodding.
Everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission.
That's right. That's what it's doing. Mainstream media, just nodding away.
To other people and allowing society to get back to normal.
All nice and normal, where there's a $5 trillion wealth transfer to the most powerful interests in the world. Let's see how that happened. Bill Gates secured hundreds of millions of dollars in profits from his foundation's impeccably timed investment in BioNTech, the Pfizer partner for its mRNA COVID shots. I'm going to invest in BioNTech now, before dramatically reversing course and proceeding to openly cast doubt on the whole of mRNA technology. I just went for dinner with that mRNA technology. I didn't know what it was doing. Gates turned his $55 million vaccine investment in Pfizer partner BioNTech into over $550 million in just under 2 years. But before you get cynical, think of the amount of help that he's going to be able to give people. The Gates Foundation banked roughly $260 million in cash from the stocks, with $242 million being untaxed profit, given that the money was invested through the foundation. That doesn't account for the additional 2 million shares that the Gates Foundation sold prior to that from its original pre-IPO equity investment. In the Q3 2021 sale, the Gates Foundation secured a return of over 15 times more than its initial investment. Over the next quarter, Gates unloaded over 1.4 million shares of CureVac, banking an estimated $50 million. Bloody hell, this is such good news for philanthropy everywhere. We're all going to be fine. Bill Gates made 2022's biggest charitable donation. See, I told you were wrong to question Bill Gates. Biggest charitable donation. How much have you given to charity? Do you fly around the world in a private jet telling people not to fly around the world on private jets and giving big charity? No, I didn't think you did. Right, so shut up then. Topping the Chronicle of Philanthropy's annual list, Gates, who is topping that list of sly bastards. No, I'm sorry, did I say sly? Philanthropy list. Who's topping that philanthropy list? Topping the Chronicle of Philanthropy's annual list, Gates gave $5 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to back the grant makers' work in global health development, policy and advocacy, and US education. So let's put aside our cynicism, because he's made the biggest charitable donation in the world, $5 billion, and he's given that to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Wait a minute. If I got this pen and I gave it to Russell Brand, wait a minute, I've still got the pen, look! Look, there it is, in my hand! Sounds a bit, to the layman, probably my lack of education, that Bill Gates gave a donation to himself, untaxed, and that can't be the reason, would it? Hold on a minute, is this whole thing a tax evasion scheme? Answer in the chat. I'm certainly not saying that. Another great hero of the pandemic, you love him, I love him, we all love him. Let's, in fact, dance around singing his name and get badges of him on ourselves. It's Anthony Fauci.
You want to be a dead end to the virus. So when the virus gets to you, you stop it.
Yeah. Get that virus and stop that there. Get the vaccine, it stops transmission. And certainly no one's going to question that. Not on this platform. An investigation by Open the Books found that Anthony Fauci and the NIH received and hid $350 million of royalties from pharma companies. In 2021, the National Institutes of Health, Anthony Fauci's employer, doled out $30 billion in government grants to roughly 56,000 recipients. However, Open the Books found hundreds of millions of dollars in payments also flow the other way. Oh wow, like a revolving door between the NIH and the pharmaceutical companies? That sounds weird. These are royalty payments from third-party payers, think pharmaceutical companies for example, back to the NIH and individual NIH scientists. Well, that was back then. It was a crazy time for all of us, the pandemic. I remember having a mental breakdown. So let's put all of that behind us and all of your suffering as well, because Anthony Fauci now is showing his true colours with his philanthropy. Oh, Anthony Fauci is charging as much as $100,000 for speaking engagements months after leaving his position in the Biden administration. Yeah, but remember when he would stand behind Trump and sort of go, that's a real hero. The former director of the NIAID's listing on leading motivational speakers is listed under the motivational speakers and healthcare speakers categories. Certainly motivated me to do a lot of things. I got quite cross. Were there any voices that were more significant than the voice of Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci during the pandemic? They set the narrative, they set the measures, they ultimately decided what direction things went in. The only voices of rebuttal and dissent came from what was called conspiracy theories, like Joe Rogan having Robert Malone on and stuff like that. Now let's get into this article, which takes us the whole way through the pandemic from a position of good faith belief in the measures, i.e. it's a unique situation, we've got to do what we can to handle it, to where we are now. This is from that conspiracy theorist journal, Newsweek. And in it, a madcap conspiracy theorist, Kevin Bass, MD, PhD student at medical school in Texas. He's in his 7th year. Sorry, I get confused when it's not convenient and I sometimes jumble those terms up. As a medical student and researcher, I staunchly supported the efforts of the public health authorities when it came to COVID-19. I believe that the authorities responded to the largest public health crisis of our lives with compassion, diligence and scientific expertise. I was with them when they called for lockdowns, vaccines and boosters. I was wrong. We in the scientific community were wrong and it cost lives. Do you remember all the times you said, I wish that they would just have an open conversation. I wish they would admit when they were wrong. I wish that they would admit that following the science is sometimes difficult because the science is a subset of corporatist interests. Natural immunity, vitamin D, none of those things were being discussed. Why? What was being discussed? Is there anything about what was being discussed and suggested that ties it into another narrative? Profitable? I can see now that the scientific community, from the CDC to the WHO to the FDA and their representatives, repeatedly overstated the evidence and misled the public about its own views and policies. There's your moment, conspiracy theorists. Hope you enjoyed it. Now get on and believe what you're supposed to believe about war or China or balloons or whatever, including on natural versus artificial immunity, school closures and disease transmission, aerosol spread, mask mandates, and vaccine effectiveness and safety, especially among the young. Basically, all of it. All of these were scientific mistakes at the time, not in hindsight. Amazingly, some of these obfuscations continue to the present day. There are things that are true that we are not allowed to say on YouTube because YouTube take WHO guidelines as their own guidelines. I don't know what that is, but it ain't good. That's why we're on Rumble. But perhaps more important than any individual error was how inherently flawed the overall approach of the scientific community was and continues to be. It was flawed in a way that undermined its efficacy and resulted in thousands, if not millions, of preventable deaths. Hold on a minute. It's not like we're seeing excess deaths everywhere, so... What we did not properly appreciate is that preferences determine how scientific expertise is used, and that our preferences might be, indeed our preferences were, very different from many of the people that we serve. We created policy based on our preferences, then justified it using data, and then we portrayed those opposing our efforts as misguided, ignorant, selfish, and evil. If you were saying that at the time, well done. I'm afraid that's all it's going to be. There's no medal or anything like that. It's just well done. And perhaps just bear that in mind going forward. Also, good luck getting your small business back on track because that money's gone to Amazon now. What a coincidence. We made science a team sport, and in doing so, we made it no longer science. It became us versus them, and they responded the only way anyone might expect them to, by resisting. We excluded important parts of the population from policy development and castigated critics, which meant that we deployed a monolithic response across an exceptionally diverse nation, forged a society more fractured than ever, and exacerbated long-standing health and economic disparities. So in a sense, the conversations that we were having, that Joe Rogan was having, those were exactly the conversations that needed to take place. And importantly, as the writer here says, you needed open-mindedness and conversation, not contempt and condemnation, not certainty and rigor, not alloying medical and scientific procedures to political beliefs. That's ideology. That's not experimentation. That's not science. And now that this has happened, what's required is an assessment and an address and an attempt to redistribute and right the wrongs that took place during that period. Our emotional response and ingrained partisanship prevented us from seeing the full impact of our actions and the people we are supposed to serve. We systematically systematically minimize the downsides of the interventions we imposed without the input, consent, and recognition of those forced to live with them. In so doing, we violated the autonomy of those who will be most negatively impacted by our policies: the poor, the working class, small business owners, blacks and Latinos, and children. These populations were overlooked because they were made invisible to us by their systematic exclusion from the dominant corporatized media machine that presumed omniscience. Ultimately, everything that we were saying has proven to be true over time. Many of us did not speak up in support of alternative views, and many of us tried to suppress them. When strong scientific voices like renowned Stanford professors like John Ioannidis, Jay Bhattacharya, and Scott Atlas, or of University of California, San Francisco professors Vinay Prasad and Monica Gandhi sounded the alarm on behalf of vulnerable communities, they faced severe censure by relentless mobs of critics and detractors in the scientific community, often not on the basis of fact, but solely on the basis of differences in scientific opinion. When former President Trump pointed out the downsides of intervention, he was dismissed publicly as a buffoon. And when Dr. Anthony Fauci opposed Trump and became the hero of the public health community, we gave him our support to do and say what he wanted, even when he was wrong. But he's making a lot of money from those public speeches now, so it's not all bad news. Trump was not remotely perfect, nor were the academic critics of consensus policy. But the scorn that we laid on them was a disaster for public trust in the pandemic response. Our approach alienated large segments of the population from what should have been a national collaborative project. When you start to accept that this analysis is correct, you have to also suspect that they knew that they were doing that and didn't care, or it served the agenda they were pursuing so effectively that they were unable to resist it. I think ultimately the elite institutions of media, corporatism and government benefit from a divided population. So a situation like this was beneficial, and we paid the price. The rage of those marginalized by the expert class exploded onto and dominated social media. Lacking the scientific lexicon to express their disagreement, many dissidents turned to conspiracy theories and a cottage industry of scientific contortionists to make their case against the expert class consensus that dominated the pandemic mainstream. I would say that it wasn't an expert class. It was a one-sided cadre of experts being utilized to underwrite a required agenda and a preset objective to ultimately facilitate the wealth transfer that we've already described, and as always takes place, whether there's a pandemic or not, the advance of the interests of the powerful. Simply put, the pandemic provided a lens to help us witness what ordinarily happens but is not so easily observable. Labeling this speech misinformation and blaming it on scientific illiteracy and ignorance, the government conspired with big tech to aggressively suppress it, erasing the valid political concerns of the government's opponents. This isn't just happening in the pandemic. This is happening now. This is happening around the war and in general around the mainstream centralist narratives we're invited to accept as true. The point of our entire channel and community, in fact, is to oppose these narratives, not just with regard to the pandemic. And in fact, the reason we're still talking about the pandemic when it's largely accepted that, broadly speaking, it's over, is because we are determined to use this example to create a new dialectic. So in the future, you don't accept that anymore. Oh, you can't say that about Ukraine. That means you don't support Ukrainian victims. You can't say that about the balloon. That means you don't support... No. We don't accept that anymore because we've seen in a concentrated time period, the way you come out is we're certain we've got the science, you lot are all hillbillies and nutters and conspiracy theorists. We've seen now that wasn't true. They were wrong. Not only that, we were right. Most of it was common sense conjecture and a set of principles around individual and community freedom. Those are the things that came to the forefront. Those are the things you cared about. Those are the things we still care about. And don't worry, because those things are still valid, and they're going to be more and more valid as what I call the establishment continues to amplify its need for control in the service of corporate interest. Now, you can use that as a utensil to analyze any news story. Hang on, this balloon story, are they going to use this to generate funding and impose control? Yeah, down the line, almost certainly. The war with Ukraine, are they going to use that? Climate change, are they going to use that? So now you can just sort of stick relatively firm. It's a good thing, because now you know you were right. So you're able to go, oh good, I'm not crazy. So what's necessary is you continue to support our channel, you continue to support one another, you continue to communicate, and you stay firm and strong. Don't turn into a nutter. Don't start thinking, oh well, if this is true, then probably that's true. They can get you on that. But if you stick to the facts, then ultimately the truth will win out. And this despite the fact that pandemic policy was created by a razor-thin sliver of American society, or an elite who anointed themselves to preside over the working class, members of academia, government, medicine, journalism, tech, and public health who are highly educated and privileged. From the comfort of their privilege, this elite prizes paternalism as opposed to average Americans who laud self-reliance and whose daily lives routinely demand that they reckon with risk. That many of our leaders neglected to consider the lived experience of those across the class divide is unconscionable. Incomprehensible to us due to this class divide, we severely judged lockdown critics as lazy, backwards, even evil. We dismissed as grifters those who represented their interests. We believed misinformation energized the ignorant, and we refused to accept that such people simply had a different valid point of view. We crafted policy for the people without consulting them. If our public health officials had led with less hubris, the course of the pandemic in the United States might have had a very different outcome with far fewer lost lives. Instead, we have witnessed a massive and ongoing loss of life in America due to distrust of vaccines and the healthcare system, a massive concentration in wealth by already wealthy elites, a rise in suicides and gun violence, especially among the poor, a near doubling of the rate of depression and anxiety disorders, especially among the young, a catastrophic loss of educational attainment among already disadvantaged children and among those most vulnerable, a massive loss of trust in healthcare, science, scientific authorities, and political leaders more broadly. So there you are. That is a voice from within the scientific establishment telling you what you already knew. And beyond that, lives were lost. There was a financial cost, there was a health cost, there was a social cost, all stuff that we were discussing throughout this pandemic because Bill Gates personally benefited, Anthony Fauci personally benefited, big tech benefited hugely, the government benefited, big pharma benefited, and ultimately, what is a crisis other than an opportunity for the powerful to double down on their interests and increase their power, to increase their authority, to eliminate the opportunity for dissent, to smear opposing voices. All of this we've seen take place over the pandemic, but this takes place across culture, across society, all of the time anyway. So stay alert and stay awake. If you enjoyed this video, please watch either of these fantastic videos. Turn on the notification bell and subscribe right now because the algorithm, guess who that works for? Guess where that's going to direct you? We make content every day. We need you to watch it. We're available every day also on Rumble. I'd love you to do all that stuff, but more important is that you please, if you can, stay free.